Chapter 24. The Wall. Sabrina heeded Theopin's directions, descending the hill to the valley where she picked up the wadi and followed it south into the wide expanse of desert, the ridge that hid the caves sinking into the horizon to her east. Within her suit, Sabrina felt whole. Moshi's most recent model continued to surprise her. As she jogged through the gravelly, dried riverbed, the suit displayed a diagram of her body on the visor, indicating that it detected her favoring her right leg. The suit compensated, routing additional power to the flexors and servos in that limb. Sabrina felt the suit bend and constrict around her. At first, she resisted and nearly stumbled. However, once she gave herself over to the pressure, she felt the suit take over, moving first her right leg, then her left. She increased her speed without pain, the suit matching her pace, as if it was running for her, and she only had to drive it. With that, she pushed her jog to a full sprint, experiencing no more exertion than a brisk walk. She moved as if the wind was at her back, feeling as if Moshi had been standing right there and just bestowed her with another one of his precious gifts. "Thank you, Moshi." The wadi wound like a road into the desert, her night vision transforming it into a landscape of emerald. The sky above was a darker shade of snowy green. 2 hours passed. Although the scenery was monotonous, Sabrina's joy was undiminished. She savored each soft, rhythmic cush of her feet in the grainy earth, the bounce of her ponytail on the back of her neck, and the warmth her body radiated into the cold desert night. After nearly 3 hours, and barely fatigued, the banks of the wadi grew shorter and eventually disappeared altogether as the riverbed opened up into a desiccated delta of crystallized hardpan. A wind picked up sand and rained it down onto her shoulders. Her night vision did not detect any ridgeline to the south, but she knew the distance on the setting was limited. She clicked the feature off, switched into the visible spectrum, and stepped into nothingness. Vertigo threatened to topple her to the ground as she struggled to regain any sense of orientation. With her naked eye, in the complete darkness of the desert, the distinction between the stars above and the crystallized hardpan beneath her feet was gone. Empty blackness closed around her like a fist, the profusion of stars mind-numbing. She felt as if she had stepped off a terrestrial plane into that cold, starry void, where the emptiness between points of light was eons and lifetimes, where she was a speck of dust, cursed with knowledge of her insignificance, certain that her intake of breath would be a sound heard across the cold, unfeeling universe. And in that void, that emptiness, there had to be something, someone, watching. She could feel it, bearing down on her, with all the malice and vengeance of a being she had never believed existed. In all that emptiness, in all that coldness, there had to be some life force that lit the spark. She was scared. "What is wrong with me?" But then Dag was beside her, his arm around her shoulders as they sat on a bench in the old city. Waves crashed on the beach not far away, while they faced the entrance to the tunnel that led under the city. It was the most direct route to the other side of the peninsula. As a grown woman, she had passed through it countless times, but this morning, as a child, she had yet to. As she stared at its mouth of gaping blackness, feeling its cold breath on her bare legs, she trembled. Moments before, she had been a warrior battling thieves in the deserted streets. But upon discovering the tunnel, real fear had struck her, and now her toy sword sat impotently at her side.
"Why are you afraid?"
Dag asked in a soft voice, a few stray whiskers that his razor had missed glinting silver along his jaw. As a child, she was unable to articulate the partially formed images that flashed through her mind, so Dag drew them out.
"Are you afraid of some animals? Rats, snakes, or scorpions?"
She nodded.
"But what if I told you I walk through this tunnel each day on my morning strolls, and that I am certain there are no rats and snakes? Besides, I've seen you kill at least one of each of those with your sword there."
3 rats, 2 snakes, and 1 scorpion, she said, the exact score very important in her 9-year-old mind.
3 rats? This proves my point exactly. They have more to fear from you than you of them. Is there something else about this place you fear? Maybe something you have not battled? Like ghosts?
She could not have said it. Even as Dag talked, she could only nod. But that indeed had been the cold grip inside of her chest. She pictured the invisible hands of the dead and doomed that had once walked these city streets, reaching out for her, passing through her like cold gusts of air, draining her of her own life. Even at 9, she knew the importance of not believing in such things, and that belief would only disappoint her uncle. So, as she made her admission, she cast her eyes downward in shame, wiping tears.
Sabrina, my brave warrior, don't cry. It is perfectly natural to believe.
It is? She asked, confused. But you've told me I mustn't.
It does not mean your instincts might tell you otherwise. If a citizen steals, or worse, murders someone, I of course want to immediately punish them, even hurt them. That is my instinct. It is natural. But it does not mean it is right to follow it. The law calls for us to be better than our animal instincts. And just as there are animal instincts we must overcome, there are human ones we must outthink as well. And belief in the supernatural is one of the prominent ones.
Why do I feel it if it is not right?
Because it has helped us survive until now. We're wired for it. We are social beings that must navigate a world of other social beings with thoughts, emotions, and motivations. We relate to other people by trying to have what we call a theory of mind. It means trying to understand what another person thinks and feels in order to get along with them.
He gestured to her sword.
If you struck me with that sword, what would I do?
You would say, ow, and then be angry.
But how do you know that? It's because you can imagine in your head what is happening in mine.
She nodded, but she did not see how this related to the ghosts waiting for her in the tunnel. Dag continued.
But sometimes this wiring goes a little haywire. Sometimes it goes too far and begins ascribing thoughts, feelings, emotions to forces that have none, like the weather or the ocean. These are complex systems our minds cannot understand, so they try to impose this theory of mind on them. And that is how primitive people ended up with the notion of a god in the sky, or the sea, or in rocks or the trees. People want an explanation so badly they will settle for a false one if it resolves complexity and uncertainty for them. And by a cruel trick of fate, it was people with this mistaken notion that were able to reproduce, and to build stable societies. Perhaps this notion allowed them to build these societies. After all, what better way to enforce law than to tell people that even when they are alone, they are being watched by invisible figures in the sky? What better way to cure loneliness and the heartache of loss than to console yourself with the thought that although your loved ones might leave you or die, there is an all-powerful being that loves you, or that your loved ones' spirits are preserved as immortal souls, or even ghosts.
As he spoke, her eyes wandered to the stone archway over the tunnel. Climbing vines spread around it, mimicking the curvature of the stones. A honeybee hovered over a flower before alighting and climbing within the blossom, his shape silhouetted against the shaking pink petals. A sea breeze found its way into the courtyard and shook the vine and blossom, and stirred dried leaves at Sabrina's feet.
So, these societies evolved,
Dag continued.
This flawed belief system, this flawed programming, so to speak, at their core. They evolved and spread so effectively that they crowded out any other societies. And now the laws of evolution took over. When there are no natural predators to check reproduction, certain traits grow out of proportion. He repositioned himself on the bench, folding his hands on his knees and leaning over to look deeply into her eyes. On one island, there was a beetle, he said, holding up his fingers as if he held the beetle between them. The male of this species used a horn on his head to defend himself against snakes. Females were attracted to the beetles with the largest horns, since this meant their own offspring would survive. Successive generations of males grew larger and larger horns. Snakes could no longer eat them, but then the horns grew so large that the beetles could only move very slowly, and as the horns grew even larger, they became the perfect handle for birds to swoop down and snatch them and eat them. So you know what happened to the beetles?
No.
They went extinct.
He paused, got up, then knelt down in front of her. She knew what was coming next must have been important. He took her hands in his.
Sabrina, humans almost went extinct too. And it was because their belief in the supernatural grew too large, their certainty and arrogance too big for their little brains. But there was no bird that came swooping in to eat the humans. Humans nearly destroyed themselves, using terrible weapons in the name of their very own deities. They ruined the planet, and as I have told you before, we are all that is left.
So we have to make sure our horns don't get too large. He smiled.
Yes, even if they sometimes grow quite naturally, even if you are wired to see the supernatural cause before the real one. But we have two secret weapons, reason and the law. Those are our swords to fight arrogance, ignorance, and hate.
He gave her sword a sharp tap with 2 fingers. She swallowed and looked into the tunnel. Her breath still caught in her chest at the sight of the inky shadows. So, there are no ghosts?
None,
he said, turning to look at the tunnel alongside her. He stood up, still holding her hand in his.
But I will go with you, this one time.
She picked up her sword, her fear dissipating like fog struck by sunlight. I'm ready. In the desert, standing on the edge of the cosmos, she watched the flashing heart monitor slow, her respiration become more even. She stared into the stars again, and knew the void facing her was empty. The stars are only stars. The wind rocked against her, sending a chill over her skin, and reminding her she needed to keep moving to remain warm. A look at the horizon revealed a silhouette against the stars. The ridge. She took a reading on her compass, set the direction, switched back to night vision, and resumed running, now confident that she was alone. The sun rose on an alien landscape. With the ridge as her guide, she had trekked south into desert scenery she could have never imagined. Hardpan crumpled underfoot, tilted at odd angles by wind and torrential rains. She passed through fields of volcanic gravel and deltas of green dust. In random seams of rock she found lonely curdy bushes and sage-grasses, all colored white, as if here in the desert only ghosts of plants could grow. To the west waited a sand sea. Giant dunes moved at a century's pace, their ridges curving back and forth like the path of a whip. In places, the dunes rose to the height of the ridge she followed, breaking through passes and spreading down the other side in a series of sandy deltas. The vanguard of the encroaching sea. The ridge she walked was the color of sunrise, its rocks wind-carved into bulbous shapes. Sabrina spied her first living animals, a desert hare, a snake, and a few lizards, all so perfectly matched to the color of their world that they seemed to be made of the sand and stone that surrounded them. The eastern side of the ridge was still in shade, its stone cool to the touch. She rested it for a few minutes, unzipping the vents in her suit and helping herself to a breakfast of water and biscuits from her pack. Her eyes were burning, and her head ached with sleepiness, but she wanted to travel farther before it became too hot. As the sun climbed, the shadow of the ridge narrowed. The readout on her visor indicated that the temperature was rising quickly. She found an overhang to rest beneath on the western side of the ridge. The space beneath was large enough so that she only had to bend at the waist to fit. The floor was rippled with fine-grained sand, no scrub, no cracked alkaline hardpan to hide scorpions. She took 2 more long swigs of water, then, while pulling out biscuits, she discovered a flatbread sandwich of crushed peas and peppers. She ate it immediately, knowing it would not last as long as the biscuits, then leaned backwards onto the powdery sand to sleep. A fringe-toed lizard with a sandy back and white underbelly was cooling off on the underside of the overhang when she woke. The last few hours she had only dozed fitfully, the heat and brightness of the sky outside making it impossible to fall into a deeper slumber. A darkling beetle made a click-click-click sound somewhere nearby. The lizard's feet made a stiff scraping noise on the rock as it repositioned itself. Heat shimmered off stones like wavering air from a furnace door. She ate a few more biscuits, watching the lizard and its slow, deliberate movements stalking the beetle. When it finally caught the unlucky insect, and the miniature drama was over, she decided it was time to go. She removed her gloves from her belt and slipped them on. Almost immediately, her hands felt damp with sweat. She stretched out, taking extra time with her right leg, secured her bag over her shoulders, snapped her visor down, and stepped out of her shelter. Flames from the sun licked her back while the stones beneath her smoldered. Her face became wet with perspiration. She did not bother trying to find an easy way over the ridge. Instead, she relied on the grips in her gloves to allow her to gain purchase in the nearly sheer face, taking her up the spine of rock. Heat radiated through her gloves. The peak was cooler with a precious breeze gently wafting across, but she slid down quickly, reluctant to linger in so visible a position. She scanned the southern horizon, but no wall waited there, only more desert, flattened under the weight of the sun. For the first hour, there was only a thin strip of shade to give her cover, making traveling brutal. The suit was sopping with perspiration. She removed her visor and covered her head in a cloth from the bag. Shade as precious a resource as water. By mid-afternoon, the rock and sand gave way to islands of green, acacia trees spreading their shade over ground that was no longer sandy, but rather fragrant with lemongrass and ginger. The profusion of smells lightened her mood, and she moved in a direction that took her beneath the trees. She even picked a stem of lemongrass and chewed it, as she had seen Sprocket do. She did not wish for this part of her passage to end, but a low rumble above brought back the reminder of the danger she faced. The screaming voices echoed off the ridge and into the hollows, making it impossible to guess where the Elved was. Running to the ridge was too great a risk. Instead, she crouched behind a tree trunk, making herself as small as possible. The roar descended like a storm on the peaceful wood, the machine coming so close that Sabrina felt a flash of heat from its engines. Branches shook. Birds scattered. The Elved passed, and diminished into the south as quickly as it had approached. The wall. Where the Elveds live. She ate again in the late afternoon, grateful that the forest spread unbroken, providing her shade and cover. Although the woods were quiet, it was a quiet that came with dread, as if the living feared the lumbering giants that raked the air with their screaming turbines and hissing flames. Eventually she came to thick groves of cedar that blanketed the valleys between ridges like a lush carpet, filling the air with their distinct scent. Even the wind that blew down from the ridges was full of the smell. It was a marked change from the worst of the desert. As evening descended and blue shadows stretched between hilltops, she chose to climb the hill to her east for an unobstructed view of the horizon. At the top of the ridge, she saw it. As long and unbroken and dust-brown as the desert itself, it looked like a rift in the earth, a fault line heaved upwards in a geological cataclysm. Closer inspection revealed symmetries and regularities that only humans could create. A perfect concave face, evenly spaced expansion joints, a railing running along the top. This was indeed the wall they had all heard about, but had never seen. It was their protection from the radioactive wastelands that covered the planet's surface, the Twin Cities' bulwark against chaos and ruin. She thought how small their patch of habitable space was, and how overwhelming the ruined wastes were. Befitting the scope of desolation on the far side, where radiation had rendered the land uninhabitable, the wall answered back with its size, impenetrability, and an impression of infinity as its sentinel towers marched to the horizon in either direction, their crowns of glowing red beacons forming a chain of embers that shimmered in the fading light. Each tower had eyes, a wraparound floor of glass windows near the top where figures moved, only visible now as the day had turned to dusk and the light from within silhouetted them. But even as Sabrina watched, some timer clicked, and every window became a mirror, hiding the figures, the eyes of the tower becoming opaque once more. The watchers cannot be watched. Never in her dreams had she imagined the wall so large, or so occupied with guards in every tower. She counted 24 in each direction. She did the math. She had only seen 3 guards in the windows before they went dark, but even with 3 guards in each tower, with so many towers encircling both Fortinbras and Lysander and the lands between, it meant a whole city of people just to occupy the wall. But how could there be so many? Where did they live? And the construction. It behooved the wall to be so massive, so beautifully uniform, so brutally elegant, the line between the hope of the world and the end of the world, between life and death. Yet it was so far beyond the engineering she had seen within Fortinbras that she could not fit her mind around it. It would take an army to build, and an army to fill. She was loath to admit it, but Theopen had been right. There was much for her to learn.